Nurse Nightingale to the ER. Nurse Nightingale. That was the nickname nobody said out loud. The whispered version followed Hannah Clarke through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial like cigarette smoke, that timid thing with the hollow eyes who took every extra shift, never complained, never asked for time off. Invisible. That's what she'd trained herself to become. That's what the Pentagon had ordered. Erase Major Hannah Clarke. Bury the Marjah operation so deep that official records wouldn't even acknowledge her security clearance. Make her a ghost. Make her forgettable. She moved through the hospital in scrubs so perfectly pressed they could cut glass, her movements economical and precise. Every interaction minimal. Every conversation kept to vital signs and medication schedules. Her name tag read H. Clarke, RN. Nothing else. Nothing that hinted at the 12 years before this, 3 tours in regions she was legally forbidden to name, 3 Purple Hearts, and a silver wedding band she still wore under her glove on the left hand. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent song as she reached for charts at the nurse's station. Morning shift, 7 a.m., the ER relatively quiet before the chaos arrived. Her left forearm caught the light, surgical scars, thin white lines like a narrative written in scar tissue. A gunshot wound from Sanjan Valley. Shrapnel from an IED near Jalabad. A knife wound from an interrogation that technically never happened. She pulled her sleeve down quickly, covering the evidence. Nobody needed to see those stories. Nobody needed to ask questions. In her locker, wrapped in an old bandana between shifts, she kept one object that defined everything, a single dog tag on a broken chain. Captain David Clarke. David had worn the matching tag until the moment an RPG took his legs and half his chest during the ambush in Marjah. She'd held the pressure on his femoral artery for minutes that felt like 4 hours, while rounds snapped overhead and her team died around her. She'd carried him 3 miles through the Afghan desert with a sucking chest wound and her own left leg compromised by a bullet that had missed the femoral by centimeters. He made it to the surgical team. He made it home. He made it to a grave in Forest Lawn Cemetery, Houston, where the rain fell like applause and the grass never quite stayed green enough to look alive. Hannah touched the dog tag once before each shift, a ritual of remembrance and a prayer that nobody would ever ask why she carried it. The monitor alarms in Trauma Bay 3 shrieked at 7:43 a.m., cutting through the morning quiet like a scalpel. Code. Chest pain, 67-year-old male, family reported he collapsed near the vending machines. The ER erupted into the controlled chaos that Hannah had learned to move through without visible panic. Doctors materialized. Nurses swarmed. Equipment clattered on metal trays. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something metallic, fear, maybe, or just the sharp copper smell of someone whose body was shutting down. She was at the bedside before the resident finished barking orders. 12 lead EKG going. 2 large bore 4s being established. The patient's oxygen saturation sitting at 84% and dropping, his breathing getting shallower, his consciousness slipping. She could read the monitor like scripture, the ST elevation telling her everything his mouth couldn't say. His airway was closing. The swelling in his throat was visible, his hands clawing at his neck. Anaphylaxis. Or something worse. Something the initial history wasn't explaining. Dr. Ashford arrived with his attending physician gait, the walk of someone who owned the hospital, who'd never questioned an order in his life. His voice carried the smooth arrogance of a man who'd never been told no. Get an airway. Now. The resident reached for the intubation kit. Hannah could see the tremor in his hands from where she was managing the fall line. He'd been out of residency for 3 months. His first emergency airway in a swelling case, and the timer was running. 60 seconds, maybe, before the patient lost the ability to breathe entirely. The resident tried twice. Failed twice. The saturation was dropping. 78%. 75. I need a surgical airway, Dr. Ashford said, not asked. Get a surgical tray. Hannah moved. The equipment cart was 15 feet away, but the emergency surgical tray wasn't stocked correctly. Someone had used the last tracheal dilator yesterday and never replaced it. She knew this because she'd organized this supply cart at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except her husband's dog tag and the sound rain made on a cemetery headstone. The emergency surgical kit was incomplete, and they didn't have 2 minutes to call another one down from the 4th floor. Her hands moved on their own. She found an MRE packet from the donation bin, the one the community center had brought 3 days ago, the one nobody ate. She tore the waterproof plastic and extracted the occlusive dressing, the chest seal apparatus designed to prevent tension pneumothorax. It was the wrong application, technically. Criminally creative. Her hands moved like muscle memory and combat experience and muscle memory again, fashioning an improvised airway support that would keep the airway patent while Dr. Ashford prepared for the formal surgical solution. She didn't ask permission. She didn't suggest it. She simply did it. The resident stepped aside. She was there. She'd assessed. She'd acted. The occlusive dressing became a temporary airway seal, and she secured it with tape that hissed against his skin. His oxygen saturation climbed immediately. 86. 90. 94%. The room went dead silent. Dr. Ashford stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, something between confusion and something darker, something that looked like recognition. Her heart rate didn't spike. Her hands didn't tremble. She simply stepped back, assuming the position of a floor nurse waiting for orders, her face arranged into the expression of someone who had merely noticed a problem and solved it without thinking. "Where did you learn that?" Dr. Ashford asked. "First aid certification," Hannah said quietly. "I read a lot." It wasn't a request. It was a command disguised as a question, and they both knew she'd lied. "You didn't learn that technique from first aid certification. You learned it from field conditions. From IED casualties. From situations where the supply chain broke down and human ingenuity was the only thing between life and death." He studied her for a moment longer, then turned away. "Get him to surgical. Prep for a formal airway. And someone stock the goddamn emergency cart properly." But when she glanced up from disconnecting the monitor leads, Dr. Ashford was looking back at her. Not at her face. At her hands. At the surgical scars visible on her wrist where her glove had slipped when she'd moved. At the efficient, practiced way her fingers had orchestrated an impossible solution from trash. He'd seen something. She could feel it the way you feel a targeting laser, that moment of recognition when your cover starts to crack. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, at 8 p.m. on a Thursday night, Hannah stood at her locker in the break room and tried to convince herself that paranoia was just experience talking. The break room smelled like old coffee and the ghost of someone's lunch from 3 days ago. The fluorescent lights buzzed in that way that made her teeth ache. She'd worked a double shift because Marcus, one of the younger nurses, had called in with his daughter's fever. She hadn't thought twice about it. Hannah didn't think twice about these things anymore. Thinking meant remembering. Remembering meant breaking down. She was reaching for her keys when she noticed the slight rearrangement of her locker contents. Her spare stethoscope wasn't quite where she'd left it. The CPR certification card had been moved. Someone had been through her belongings methodically enough to try to leave it undisturbed, but not methodically enough to fool someone trained in security protocols. Dr. Ashford had been through her locker. Her throat didn't tighten. Her hands didn't shake. The training kicked in, breathe normally, heart rate controlled, assume a neutral expression. She'd survived worse men than Ashford. She'd survived firefights in Helmand Province with bullets snapping so close she could hear the pressure differential. She'd survived interrogation by people who wanted information badly enough to break fingers, one at a time. She'd survived her husband's death by learning how to fold the grief into a place inside her chest where it couldn't spread to her voice. She could survive a hospital administrator. But what she couldn't survive was being sent back. If Ashford started asking questions, if his investigation went deep enough, if someone decided her inconsistent background warranted federal scrutiny, the Pentagon's erasure program would activate. She'd be reassigned. Separated. Disappeared in a way that made civilian disappearance look like retirement. The next day was Friday. Hannah found herself at Forest Lawn Cemetery in the late afternoon, standing in front of David's headstone while the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. Rain was coming. She could smell it on the wind, that particular humidity that preceded a Houston storm. Captain David Clarke, the stone read. Beloved husband. Decorated service member. The dates of his life boxed neatly in granite. 1983 to 2016. 33 years old. She'd been his medic for 14 of those years. She'd been his wife for 7. I'm sorry, she whispered to the rain that was starting to fall. I'm sorry. I promised you I'd disappear. I promised I'd stay invisible. I said I'd do this one thing, just stay quiet, just be nobody, just let the Pentagon's erasure program work like it was supposed to. The sobs came from somewhere deep and broken, the kind of crying that hurt your ribs. I failed. You can't fail at disappearing, and I failed. I got noticed. I used the field medicine and I forgot the rule. I forgot that hands that know how to do that aren't supposed to exist anymore. The rain fell harder. Lightning flickered across the sky like a warning. She stood there soaked through, barely noticing the cold, barely noticing anything except the fact that she'd survived her husband's death only to ensure her own destruction. When she got back to Oak Creek Memorial for the Saturday morning shift, the hospital had changed in the way hospitals change when someone's been asking questions. The receptionist made eye contact instead of looking away. One of the other nurses asked if she was feeling okay in a voice that suggested this wasn't genuine concern. And in the nurse's station, reviewing her employment file with the kind of intensity usually reserved for forensic examination, was Dr. Ashford. He didn't look up when she approached. He simply turned the file slightly so she could see it, not see into it, but see that it was open, that he was reading it, that whatever he was looking for, he'd started looking. His fingers tapped once on her vaccination records, once on her hire date, once on the reference line from the staffing agency that had temporarily placed her. 3 taps. A countdown. Your background is interesting, Hannah, he said without looking up. His voice was the kind of polite that came from someone who'd decided you were already beneath him. There's a gap here. 19 years. Where were you between 2003 and 2022? She didn't flinch. Educational deferment and postgraduate work. It wasn't a question. It was a command disguised as a statement, and they both knew she'd lied. But she also knew that he couldn't prove it. The Pentagon had scrubbed her records too thoroughly for civilian databases. He could suspect. He could investigate. But official records would support nothing but the simplest explanation: a woman who'd worked in medical administration, who'd come home, who'd needed a quiet job in a quiet hospital. Interesting, he said again, finally looking at her. His eyes were the color of cold water. Because nurses don't usually perform field tracheotomies. Nurses don't usually have that kind of muscle memory. And nurses don't usually move like you move, Hannah. She met his gaze without blinking. Is there a problem with my work, doctor? Not yet, he said, and smiled. But there will be. He closed her file with the kind of deliberate finality that felt like the first move in a chess game that had already decided its outcome. He stood, adjusted his white coat with meticulous precision, and walked past her close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressively unremarkable. That night, Hannah sat in her apartment in the dark with her laptop, running search protocols on things she wasn't supposed to search for. Military records databases. Pentagon security clearances. Names from her team that had been classified and then declassified and then classified again. The dog tag sat on the kitchen table in front of her, catching the light from the screen. Captain David Clarke. The Pentagon had wanted him erased. They'd wanted her erased. Marjah was supposed to stay buried, an operation so black that even Congress didn't know the full scope of it. And now there was a hospital administrator with cold eyes and suspicious fingers who'd figured out that something about her story didn't fit. She'd survived firefights. She'd survived grief. She'd survived the deliberate government choice to erase her from official existence. But she didn't know if she could survive being seen. The overhead page crackled at 3:15 p.m., cutting through the shift-change chaos of Oak Creek Memorial's hallways. Nurse Nightingale to the ER. Nurse Nightingale to the ER. Dr. Ashford's voice dripped mockery through every speaker on every floor. At the nurse's station, 6 residents turned in unison, smirking. The nickname hung in the fluorescent air like smoke. Hannah kept walking. Her stride didn't falter. Her jaw tightened, imperceptibly, but her legs carried her forward with the same measured pace she'd learned in combat drills, the kind of composure that came from understanding that flinching only gave predators confirmation you were prey. She didn't look at them. That was the key. Looking acknowledged the humiliation. Looking meant it landed. Instead, she counted her steps to the supply closet where she'd scheduled her restocking break. 37 steps. She knew the exact distance now. She'd counted it every shift for 2 weeks since Ashford had started watching her with the intensity of a man who'd caught the scent of something wrong. The supply closet smelled like antiseptic and cardboard, clean, orderly, the smell of control. Hannah was rotating for bags on the 3rd shelf when the door swung open and Ashford filled the frame. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly, broad-shouldered in that way privilege gave men who'd never had to earn their presence through competence alone. He blocked the exit without seeming to try. "You know what I find fascinating, Clarke?" His voice carried the careful precision of a man enjoying his own intelligence. "Your resume says you worked at a clinic in Nevada for 2 years. Henderson Valley Health Services, wasn't it?" He pulled out his phone, reading from notes. "When I called, they had no record of you. Not in billing. Not in HR. Not in payroll. Interesting for someone who supposedly spent 24 months there." Hannah's hands continued their work. Alphabetizing. Rotating stock. Her breathing stayed level, in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. Combat breathing. She'd taught it to medics under fire. "People with inconsistent backgrounds don't last long at my hospital." Ashford stepped closer, his shoe crossing the threshold into her space. "Especially people who think they're too good to follow proper protocol. Too good to ask for help. Too good to integrate with the team." He leaned against the doorframe, blocking the exit completely now. Voice dropping into conversational territory, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I can smell a liar from across the ER. Whatever you're hiding, Clarke, I'm going to find it. And when I do, you'll be lucky to work at a veterinary clinic. You understand me?" Hannah met his eyes without blinking. Her hand stilled on a bag of normal saline. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, a sound she'd learned to filter out, but now it pressed down like a physical weight. She could feel his certainty radiating across 3 feet of space. He believed he'd already won. That was the advantage of not knowing who you were actually standing across from. "I follow every protocol, Doctor." Her voice came out flat as a heartbeat monitor between compressions. He smiled. The smile of a man who interpreted quiet compliance as confirmation of guilt. "We'll see." He stepped back, giving her space to pass. She waited until he was finished, until the threat had been made and catalogued, then took one measured breath. A single tear formed, unbidden, unwelcome, at the corner of her left eye. She reached up and wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Without flinching. Without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her shake. "I've survived worse men than you, Doctor." The words came out with the temperature of a hospital freezer. Not angry. Worse than angry. Certain. Something flickered across his face then. A moment where the smile faltered. Where he tried to place what he was actually looking at and couldn't quite identify it. Then it passed. He straightened, reasserting his position as the man who controlled this hospital, this floor, her schedule, her fate. Weekend overnights. Effective immediately. The parking lot demotion came at end of shift, 11:02 p.m. on a Thursday, when the Texas heat was still radiating off asphalt despite the darkness. 6 nurses were unloading their bags from a carpool, laughing about something on Instagram, when Ashford appeared with a printed schedule in his hands. He held it between 2 fingers like it was evidence he'd collected. "Clarke, you're being moved to weekend overnights. Effective immediately. Performance concerns. Failure to integrate with the team. Inability to work within established hierarchies." He smiled at the other nurses. "Made it public. Made it theatrical. I'm sure you understand." Nurse Rodriguez gasped audibly. Weekend overnights was the department's exile ward. The place careers went to be forgotten. Hannah took the schedule. Her hand was perfectly steady. The paper didn't shake in her grip. She folded it once and nodded. "Yes, doctor." She walked to her car, a 2009 Honda Civic with a check engine light that never turned off, and sat in the driver's seat. The vinyl smelled like previous owner's cigarettes and the pine-scented air freshener she kept trying unsuccessfully to mask the smell with. She gripped the steering wheel, and for 30 seconds her knuckles went white. The muscles in her forearms tensed with force that had no outlet, no target, no acceptable direction. Then she released. Breathed. Released again. 2 weeks of overnight shifts meant 2 a.m. starts and 10 a.m. finishes, inverting her circadian rhythm into a biological war with itself. It meant missing every morning briefing, every departmental meeting, every opportunity to be seen doing competent work. It meant being archived. Invisible in a different way, not by choice this time, but by punishment. The dog tag hidden in her locker felt heavier somehow, even though she wasn't touching it. The first 14 days of overnights blurred into one long grey corridor. Hannah worked trauma bays at 3 a.m. when the city's violence emerged like nocturnal predators. Overdoses. Stab wounds. Car accidents caused by drivers who shouldn't have been conscious. She worked quickly, correctly, asking permission from whoever physician happened to be on call, always someone junior, often someone who resented that she seemed to know what she was doing without being told. She didn't volunteer information. She executed protocol. She became the kind of excellent that no one noticed because she'd learned to deliver it without presence, without demand, without any signal that she expected recognition. The dog tag stayed in her locker. She touched it once each shift, just to confirm it was still there. That Marjah was still there. That the woman who'd carried her husband 3 miles with a bullet in her own leg was still real, even if the rest of the world had been ordered to forget she existed. At 2:16 a.m. on a Saturday, the 16th night of her exile, Hannah noticed something at the nurses' station that made her tactical assessment systems ignite. Colonel Mitchell, the Air Force officer who'd been admitted 6 hours earlier with chest pains and minimal security, was alone in room except for a single Houston PD officer who kept stepping out for coffee. She'd seen the news reports. Mitchell had testified against a defense contractor whose brother had made federal threats. Had vowed consequences. Had been specific about those consequences in a way that prompted FBI follow-up. She mentioned it to the charge nurse, Patricia, who'd worked overnights for 7 years and had learned to see Hannah as either incompetent or dramatic. "Dr. Ashford says you're paranoid. Stop trying to create drama." Patricia didn't look up from her charting. At 2:24 a.m., the automatic ER doors exploded inward like something had detonated on the other side. A man in a dark jacket was screaming, "Where's the colonel? Where's the man who killed my brother?" He held a 10-inch combat knife, the kind that had a slight curve to the blade, designed for application rather than general purpose. Hannah recognized it instantly. She'd seen that blade configuration in Helmand Province. Had seen it used. Dr. Ashford and 2 residents sprinted toward the stairwell without breaking stride. The man moved toward room 4. Hannah was 14 feet away. The distance calculated itself in her nervous system before her conscious mind caught up. 15 feet became 12. 10. The assessment took 3 seconds. The threat level. The skill indicators. The probability of Mitchell sustaining a fatal injury if no one intervened. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to stay buried. The Pentagon had ordered her erased for a reason, the official reason being that her existence in theater had complicated diplomatic relationships and her record in Marjah had created awkward questions about chain of command failures. The man kicked open the door to room 4. Colonel Mitchell was trying to get out of bed, his cardiac leads tangling, monitors blaring in protest. Hannah moved. She didn't remember deciding. Her body executed the decision her training had made years ago. She was between the knife and the bed before the downswing completed its arc. The blade caught her left shoulder as she grabbed his wrist, and the pain came in white-hot waves, distant and immediate simultaneously. Pain was information. Pain was data. Her hands moved on instinct, a combat disarm learned at Fort Bragg, leverage and anatomy, and the precise moment when resistance becomes liability. She twisted his arm with calculated pressure, but he was larger, wider, and the knife freed itself from her grip. The second stab hit her ribcage as she tackled him. Her blood spread across the white linoleum in a pattern she recognized from a different desert under a different sky. She pinned his knife hand to the floor, her vision graying at the edges but her grip absolute. The technique was muscle memory so deep it didn't require consciousness. Security arrived as she was controlling his arm. As she was doing the job Ashford had run away from. Colonel Mitchell was staring at her with an expression that looked like recognition, but that wasn't possible. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered. Hannah's vision contracted to a single point. The dog tag was still in her locker. Her husband was still dead. Marjah was still classified. She was still supposed to be nobody. She collapsed before she could answer. 2 weeks into the weekend overnight exile, Hannah stood at the nurse's station at 2:51 a.m. on a Saturday, scrolling through the census board with a thermometer in her pocket and the kind of exhaustion that came from sleeping in hospital-grade darkness. The fluorescents overhead cast everything in sickly white. Around her, the hospital breathed the shallow rhythm of the graveyard shift, fewer nurses, skeleton crew, the kind of skeleton crew where nobody asked questions if you stayed late or started early. She noticed something wrong with the monitor display for room 4. The vital signs glitched. Just once. A stutter in the numbers. Most nurses wouldn't have caught it. Most nurses didn't spend 8 years reading vitals by candlelight in mud compounds where electrical systems failed every 12 hours. She walked toward the room to check on Colonel Mitchell, the Air Force patient who'd been admitted 3 days ago with a perforated bowel from a vehicle collision. Stable now. Healing. She didn't expect what came next. The ER doors exploded open at 2:19 a.m. Not the sliding glass kind that whisper, these doors crashed like a breech charge, and every person within 50 yards heard the sound and knew immediately that someone had just decided the rules didn't apply. A man screamed into the chaos, his voice raw as a fighter jet at full throttle, his body moving with the kind of velocity that only came from pure rage. "Where's Colonel Mitchell?" "Room 4. "I know he's here." "Mitchell." "The man who testified against my brother." "He had a knife." "Not a small one. The kind of blade that catches light and makes your primitive's brain recognize death." He was maybe 30, Hispanic, hollow-eyed in a way that suggested he'd already decided his life was over and he was just tying up loose ends. The night nurse, Jennifer, who'd been working ER for 6 months, froze at the medication cart, her hand still on a bottle of lorazepam, her body suddenly heavier than it had been a second before. Dr. Ashford appeared from the direction of the physician's lounge, took one look at the man with the knife, and moved. Not toward the threat. Away from it. He gestured to 2 residents who'd been charting in the alcove, and all 3 of them pivoted toward the stairwell exit with the kind of synchronized movement that suggested they'd already calculated exactly how long it would take to reach safety. The residents were faster. They didn't look back. Dr. Ashford paused at the doorway to the stairwell, made eye contact with Hannah across the distance of the ER floor, and in that moment something shifted. She saw it in his eyes. Not fear. Recognition. He was thinking about the field tracheotomy. About her hands. About the things her body remembered that her employment file said she'd never learned. Then the door closed behind him and he was gone. Hannah moved. Not toward the exit. Toward the patient. Muscle memory was a river and she was just the thing flowing through it. The gunman was maybe 10 feet from Mitchell's room, screaming the colonel's name, and Hannah stepped into the doorway of room 4 with her hands visible and her voice dropped to the frequency that made aggressive people listen whether they wanted to or not. "He's sedated. You don't want to do this." The words came out shaped like a command, even though she'd spent 2 weeks saying yes, doctor, and of course, doctor to a man who'd spent 2 weeks unmanning her. This man wasn't a doctor. This man was a problem and she was trained for exactly this problem. He saw her and hesitated for maybe 1/3 of a second, and in that fraction of time his brain calculated that she was a nurse, which meant she was not a threat, which meant he could move through her or around her or over her toward the patient in the bed who'd sent his brother to federal prison for weapons trafficking. He moved forward. The knife came up. Hannah's left shoulder took the first stab, the blade sliding between the deltoid and the pectoralis major with the kind of burning certainty that made her understand immediately that this was real and deep and would require a surgeon to map. Blood and pain were the same thing. Pain was just information delivered by biology. She'd learned this in Marjah when a sniper round took out her team's medic, and she'd had to decide whether to bleed out or move. She moved. Her right hand grabbed his wrist, the one with the knife, and twisted it backward with the precision of someone who'd been trained by the military's best hand-to-hand instructors, and the blade came loose, and then she had him. She brought him down. Her ribs caught the second stab on the way, the knife sliding between the 5th and 6th intercostal space, and it felt like lightning, like ice, like the moment right before your body decides whether it's staying or leaving. She tackled him to the ground. Her hands executed a combat disarm she wasn't supposed to remember, couldn't have trained for in any civilian context, her body moving with the terrifying fluid precision of a thing that had been built for exactly this kind of crisis by a government that had spent years turning her into a weapon and then told her to forget it ever happened. The knife clattered across the linoleum. Security arrived 18 seconds later, 2 officers, then 3, then the Houston PD uniforms coming through the ER doors because someone had hit a panic button and the city had heard about it. Hannah was on her back. Her left shoulder was bleeding. Her ribs were bleeding. The colonel was screaming something about medical attention. Someone, maybe Jennifer, was already wrapping her shoulder with trauma shears and a sterile dressing, professional, methodical, the way nurses did when one of their own went down. The gunman was restrained, handcuffed, his face pressed against the floor, screaming about his brother, about testimony, about justice that would never come because his brother was doing 15 years and Hannah had just given up her entire life to keep a patient safe. An ambulance crew arrived. Paramedics. She tried to sit up and her ribs sent her a message in the form of white-hot pain, and she understood with the clarity of morphine that she'd been stabbed with enough force to possibly hit something important. Pneumothorax. Hemothorax. The words were medical, but they were also about stopping. About ending. They loaded her on a stretcher. They started 2-4s, she felt the burn of the 18-gauge needle sliding into the vein on her right wrist, felt them run fluid wide open, felt the portable ultrasound machine pressing against her ribcage while someone shouted percentages into a radio. 50% lung collapse. Possible diaphragm involvement. Massive hemorrhage protocol. She closed her eyes. She could feel her heart rate climbing, the monitor was shrieking at about 130, then 140, then the medic said something about blood administration, and she felt the warmth of whole blood arriving in massive quantities, and then someone was pushing something into her for line and the world was sliding sideways and she understood that she was heading into surgery and that she wouldn't be conscious for it. The surgery took 5 hours. When she woke in the recovery room, the first thing she noticed was the officers standing outside her door, 2 Houston police, positioned with their backs to her window, their bodies angled outward, preventing entry rather than allowing it. Through the paned glass, she could see the hallway. Dr. Ashford was there. Arguing. His voice came through muffled but distinct, the tone unmistakable. He was furious, and furious men were always dangerous in hospitals because they had authority and access and the ability to write things down that became facts just because they'd written them. Standing opposite him was a man in Air Force dress blues, pressed to perfection, insignia gleaming, the kind of military bearing that made civilians look soft by comparison. This man was listening, not talking. His face was the neutral expression of someone who'd learned that silence was the loudest weapon available. "This woman is a liability," Dr. Ashford was saying. He was holding papers. Several papers. His hands were moving, gesturing aggressively like the papers were proof of something. Attacking a visitor. Engaging a violent individual instead of evacuating the premises. It's assault. It's abandoning her post. And I've already documented, I've already filed termination paperwork with psychiatric evaluation. She's unstable. Clearly unstable. The officer said something Hannah couldn't hear. Dr. Ashford's face went red. Not the red of effort. The red of being contradicted. I run this ER. Not you. Not the military. This is a civilian hospital and that woman is under my supervision and I've already made calls. 3 calls. To medical board members. Every one of them is going to recommend her immediate termination. He made 3 more calls while the officer watched, each one louder than the last, each one reaching deeper into a network of colleagues who owed him favors or feared him or both. The Air Force officer listened without speaking, and that silence was the most dangerous thing in the hallway because it meant someone was already calculating how to move against someone who'd just committed several felonies in front of a witness. That night, alone in her recovery room with the morphine drip humming and the hospital sounds layering over each other, ventilators, monitors, the distant beep of a code blue in another wing, Hannah reached her breaking point. She thought about David's grave. She'd been there 2 days ago, standing in the rain, her dress uniform soaked through, telling him through sobs that she'd failed at her only assignment, which was to disappear. She'd broken her promise. She'd broken the central agreement of her new life: stay invisible, stay erased, stay dead. Everything they'd sacrificed in Marjah, every operation that had killed everyone in her team except the colonel and left her husband in the ground under a government flag, had been for nothing. The government had erased her? Given her a civilian nursing license and a social security number that wasn't hers and told her to never speak about what she'd been. And she'd nearly followed those instructions for 2 years, had stood silently while Dr. Ashford demolished her, had accepted every humiliation and every reassignment and every mockery, had buried herself deeper than any grave. But the moment the gunman's knife came up, something had broken. The orders didn't matter anymore. The erasure didn't matter. The pretending had stopped working. Her body had just betrayed every instruction the Pentagon had given her by saving the life of the one man who could connect her back to Marjah, back to David, back to everything she was supposed to forget. The recovery room monitors beeped their steady rhythm when Hannah's eyes opened. Fog lifted slowly. White ceiling. Fluorescent light. Pain lived in her shoulder and ribcage, sharp, focused, real. She tried to move. Her left arm wouldn't cooperate. Bandages. Lots of them. She counted the seconds between heartbeats. 84. Normal. Good. 5 hours post-op meant the bleeding had stopped, the surgeons had closed her up, and she was still breathing without a tube. The small victories. But something was wrong with the room. She noticed it in the way the air felt different. Heavy. Charged. Like the moment before lightning strikes. 2 uniformed figures stood at the door, not hospital security in their blue polos, but Air Force security forces in pressed blues, hands resting deliberately neutral. They weren't looking at the monitor or her chart. They were looking at her. Waiting. Hannah's heart rate spiked. The monitor picked it up immediately. 92. 96. 100. She recognized the look. She'd worn that same expression herself, 8 years ago, in places that didn't exist on maps. The look of soldiers following orders they couldn't discuss. The look of people whose phones probably had an encrypted line to someone very high up. The hallway erupted in noise. Dr. Ashford's voice cut through the intercom static like a scalpel. I don't care what authorization you have. You cannot land military aircraft on a civilian hospital without, his words were clipped off mid-sentence by someone else speaking. Authority in motion. The sound of boots on tile, precise, coordinated, the kind of footsteps that came from years of walking in formation. Then came the sound that stopped everything else, the distinctive whump-whump-whump of rotor wash, the entire building trembling as something massive descended toward the roof. The windows rattled. A nurse's medication cart rolled 3 inches across the station. Someone gasped. Hannah closed her eyes. This was it. 8 years of invisibility, 8 years of hiding in plain sight, and it was ending the way she'd always known it would, not with quiet resignation, but with thunder. With military birds. With the world she'd been told to forget suddenly crashing back down through the hospital ceiling. The door to her room opened. A man in dress blues walked past the security forces without hesitation, moving with the kind of confidence that came from having authority printed on official paper. Pentagon liaison. 50 years old, sharp jaw like cut granite, eyes that had probably seen classified briefings that made headlines disappear. 2 staff members flanked him. Behind them, Dr. Ashford materialized in the hallway, his phone still pressed to his ear, face flushed with the color of a man accustomed to getting his way. You can't just land helicopters and demand access to my personnel, Dr. Ashford said, his voice rising. This is a federal medical facility and I am chief of emergency medicine, Anne. The liaison didn't slow down. He didn't even glance at Dr. Ashford. He reached Hannah's door, knocked once, and entered, closing the door behind him before Dr. Ashford could finish his sentence. The gesture was polite. It was also a command. Step back. Through the small window in the door, Hannah could see the hallway filling with people. Nurses. Residents. Respiratory therapists. Every staff member within 50 feet drawn by the gravity of it, the unmistakable presence of something massive shifting, something hidden suddenly exposed to light. The liaison pulled a folder from his briefcase. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. His hands moved with the same precision Hannah remembered from David's command staff briefings, every gesture economical, every motion purposeful. He opened the folder and extended it toward her. Hannah's hands shook as she took it. Her own face stared back at her. Official military photograph, hair regulation length, chin at exactly the right angle. But not as Hannah Clarke, RN. The nameplate read, Clarke, Hannah J. MAJ, USAF. 2 silver stars pinned to a dress uniform she couldn't remember wearing. A Purple Heart. An Air Force Cross. Below those, in typescript that blurred as her eyes flooded, service record sealed BY Department of Defense Order 12 Sierra. The dates made her stomach turn. Marjah. 2013 to 2015, Operation Steel Resolve. Operation Marjah Guardian. David's dates too. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't look at the liaison. She couldn't do anything but stare at the ghost of herself frozen in military dress. Major Clarke, the liaison said, his voice carrying through the door into the hallway where she knew, she could feel, every person within 20 feet was listening. I'm Pentagon Liaison Colonel James Bradford. I'm here to inform you that your status has been changed from KIA to inactive duty medical, effective immediately. The hallway went so quiet the heart monitor became deafening. Beep. 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 Hannah couldn't speak. She couldn't move. The trembling wasn't fear. It was recognition. It was 8 years of running crashing into 8 years of lies, and the collision point was this room, this moment, this folder with her own medals staring back at her like accusations. Your records were sealed for your protection, Bradford continued. You were told to disappear. Those orders came from the Pentagon. No one knew where you were. Until Colonel Mitchell regained consciousness 3 hours ago and asked for the medic who saved his life in Marjah. He gave us a name and a date and a location, and we pulled records that officially don't exist. You were very thorough, Major. But you weren't thorough enough to hide from someone who knew exactly what to look for. The door opened again. Another officer appeared, Taller, built like someone who'd spent 20 years in the weight room, fatigues that were actually combat-worn, not dress blue theater. His name tape read Harrison. Navy SEAL team insignia on his shoulder. He looked directly at Hannah for exactly 1 second, long enough for her to see something ancient in his eyes, something that had also been to Marjah and never come back the same, and then he spoke loud enough for the hallway to hear every word. "Commander Harrison, SEAL Team 3, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everything else in the room feel smaller. Major Clarke held a perimeter alone for 4 hours after an ambush killed her entire team. She was shot twice. Had a compound fracture in her left femur. And she still carried Colonel Mitchell 3 miles through hostile territory while calling in close air support." He paused. His jaw tightened. That close air support saved 47 coalition lives. Including the colonel's. She earned the Air Force Cross that day. We've been looking for her for 8 years. The Pentagon classified her out of existence to keep her safe. She was never supposed to be found. Hannah's vision blurred completely. She couldn't cry, not here, not with people watching, but her body was already betraying her, was already surrendering 8 years of control in front of witnesses. Her hand shook so badly the folder slipped toward the blanket. She pressed it against her chest instead. In the hallway, a nurse was openly crying. Another had his hand over his mouth. Dr. Ashford stood frozen at the back of the crowd, his phone still in his hand, his face draining of color as he calculated what he'd just witnessed. What he'd just attempted to destroy. "There's one more thing," Bradford said quietly, looking at Hannah but speaking again for the hallway to hear. "We recovered something from the evidence locker downstairs. Personal effects from the 2015 operation. It was being held in a sealed case marked for destruction. The orders came through this morning to open it and verify its contents before final disposition." He opened the folder again. Removed a single item wrapped in archival tissue paper. He unfolded it carefully, like it might break. Like it might shatter everything she'd built. Dog tags. 2 of them. Both on a single broken chain. Bradford set them on the table beside her bed. One had her name. One had David's. Hannah's hand moved on its own, muscle memory that 8 years of civilian life couldn't suppress. Her fingers closed around the cold metal. For a moment, just a moment, she was back in Marjah. She was back in the moment she took them off David's neck after the ambush, after the decision was made to preserve the body for transport, after she understood that carrying him 3 miles meant leaving pieces of him behind. She was back in the moment she chose which piece to keep. The dog tags were marked for destruction in 2016, Bradford said quietly. But someone filed an appeal. It took 3 years to go through DOD review, but the appeal was granted. The tags are yours, Major. You earned the right to keep them. Hannah clutched them. She still didn't cry. She still didn't break. But her knuckles went white. The metal bit into her palm. Pain was information. This pain told her everything, that David was gone, that she'd been running from that truth for 8 years, that hiding hadn't made it any less true. That Major Hannah Clarke and civilian nurse Hannah Clarke weren't different people. They were the same person, living in 2 halves, and neither half was complete. The door opened one more time. An FBI agent in a charcoal suit, hair pulled back, badge hanging at her waist. She walked past Bradford without acknowledging him and directly confronted Dr. Ashford in the hallway. Her voice was professional. It was also merciless. "Dr. Ashford, we've been investigating you for 6 months for selling patient information to malpractice attorneys. Class action hospital data. Very profitable. Very illegal." She pulled out a piece of paper. 3 hours ago, you attempted to access and alter medical records in the Department of Defense database. Cybercom flagged the intrusion automatically. You forged duty log timestamps to fabricate evidence of abandonment. You altered military medical records to add psychiatric flags that don't exist. And you attempted to delete classified service records. Those are federal crimes, sir. Dr. Ashford's face went from red to white to something between the two, a color that looked like the moment when a man realizes everything he's built is collapsing. He looked around wildly, searching for an ally, for someone he'd managed to keep on his side. Every face in the hallway was turned away from him. Every nurse he'd humiliated, every resident he'd bullied, every staff member he'd weaponized against, all of them just watched. "I was just verifying her background," he started, his voice smaller now, desperate. "I run this ER, and someone with inconsistencies." "You ran this ER," the FBI agent corrected. "As of this moment, you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say." She read him his rights while two uniformed officers moved forward with handcuffs. Dr. Ashford's phone clattered to the floor. His face turned away from the crowd. His hands went behind his back without resistance. The handcuffs clicked. The sound echoed down the hallway like punctuation, like a period at the end of a sentence that nobody wanted to hear but everyone needed to. Hannah watched through the window as they led him past the recovery room. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. Some endings weren't dramatic. Some were just quiet, like a man disappearing into an elevator, into a system that was going to handle everything else without her consent or input. Bradford closed the folder. He set it gently on the bedside table next to the dog tags. "Welcome back, Major," he said. "We have a lot to discuss. But first, you need to rest. Colonel Mitchell wants to see you when you're ready. He's been asking since he woke up. He said the same thing 3 times, tell her I'm alive because of what she did in Marjah. Tell her I've been carrying that weight for 8 years, and I'm ready to put it down." Hannah held the dog tags, David and herself intertwined on a single broken chain, and for the first time in 8 years, she didn't reach for control. She didn't reach for composure. She didn't reach for the cage she'd built around everything she'd survived. She just held the weight of it all and let herself feel the full measure of what it meant to be found. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The hospital continued its endless motion. And in a recovery room on the 4th floor of Oak Creek Memorial, a major in the United States Air Force finally stopped being invisible. The recovery room smelled like antiseptic and something underneath, the acrid copper of blood that wouldn't quite wash away, no matter how many times they'd cleaned. Hannah's left shoulder throbbed in a way that felt almost rhythmic, like her body was taking attendance of every cell that had been cut through. The 4 line hissed softly. Somewhere beyond the glass partition, Oak Creek Memorial continued its endless motion, codes and consultations and the terrible machinery of keeping people alive. But in this room, there was only quiet. Only the weight of 8 years finally becoming visible. The door opened without a knock. Colonel Mitchell moved through it on crutches, his dress uniform immaculate except for the left leg bent at an angle that spoke of fresh surgery and borrowed time. His eyes found hers immediately. Not the grateful look of a man who'd been saved. Something older. Something that recognized itself. "Major," he said, and the word landed like a salute. Hannah's breath caught. No one had called her that since Marjah. The title hung in the recycled hospital air like a ghost finally given permission to speak. "That's twice you've saved my life," Mitchell continued, moving to the chair beside her bed with the careful precision of someone learning to walk twice. "Once in Marjah when you carried me 3 miles with a bullet in your leg. And last night." He settled himself, the crutches falling against the wall with a sound like a rifle being secured. "They told me you died. 8 years ago. They had a memorial. I carried your husband's dog tag the whole time, waiting to find out the truth." Hannah's hands moved involuntarily. She felt the pain in her shoulder spike, a reminder that her body was still learning what it meant to be real again. The machines around her beeped their steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Normal sinus rhythm. Still here. Still alive. Mitchell pulled a chain from his uniform pocket. The metal caught the fluorescent light like a sun through water. A dog tag. David's dog tag. The matching one to the broken chain Hannah kept hidden in her locker, the one she'd worn against her skin for 8 years like a secret prayer. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended the possibility of staying invisible forever. The Pentagon liaison entered first, walking with the bearing of someone who spent their life moving between worlds that didn't officially exist. Behind him came the Navy SEAL commander, a man whose call sign Hannah had heard whispered in field hospitals and fire-base tents, the kind of warrior who moved like apex predators learning to walk on their hind legs. 3 more figures followed. Officers. Uniforms that spoke in the language of authority Hannah's body recognized before her mind could catch up. The liaison opened a file folder with the kind of ceremony reserved for classified materials and reckoning. "Silver Star," he said, and his voice echoed like a courtroom. "Operation Corazon, Paktika Province. Held a perimeter alone for 4 hours after ambush. 17 friendly casualties prevented by direct action and medical triage under fire." He turned the page. Another medal citation lay beneath. "Silver Star. Second action, same operation. Led convoy extraction of 43 personnel through hostile territory while operating at 70% capacity due to combat injury. Direct fire suppression that prevented secondary ambush formation." Mitchell's eyes glistened. His hand found the arm of the chair. "Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster," the liaison continued, and his tone changed, dropped lower, the way people spoke about sacrifice. "Marjah Valley. Multiple fragmentation wounds and sustained blast exposure. Return to duty after treatment. Second injury event, same location. Field amputation of own foot via chemical tourniquet to prevent exsanguination. Did not evacuate. Continued operations for additional 6 hours. Hannah's shoulder burned. That was a small pain. A nothing pain. Compared to 8 years of carrying weight that wasn't supposed to exist, compared to walking through hospital corridors as a ghost, compared to watching another medic, a good one, get cut down by a man's envy and cruelty. The liaison closed the folder. "Your government was wrong to erase you, Major. That ends today." The Navy SEAL commander stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of men who had seen combat and come home different. "I was with your team in Helmand Province. That perimeter you held, we found the bodies of insurgents that had been engaged at ranges requiring precision shooting and hand-to-hand contact. 17 combatants. You did that. After your team was already gone. After your husband was already gone." He stopped. The room held its breath. "Your legend kept us alive. Every medic that came after you was safer because you proved what was possible. What you were capable of." The doors burst open again. 3 FBI agents in blue windbreakers, moving with the kind of purpose that meant an ending was coming. They walked past Dr. Ashford, who'd been standing in the corner the entire time, his face the color of a man watching his career vaporize, and stopped in front of the liaison. "Dr. Richard Ashford," the senior agent said, and the formality of it was damning. "We're placing you under arrest for selling protected health information to malpractice attorneys. 6 months of investigation has documented 47 separate incidents of patient data breach resulting in settlements totaling $3.2 million. Ashford's mouth opened. His hand reached for something, explanation, denial, anything that might change the trajectory of what was happening. The agent continued, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "Additionally, we have evidence that you attempted to alter military records in the Defense Personnel Security Research Center database. Identity fraud. Federal obstruction. These charges add a minimum of 8 years to your sentence." The handcuffs closed with a sound like a period ending a sentence. Definitive. Final. They walked him out past the nurse's station where Rodriguez stood with her arms crossed, watching with the kind of silence that was louder than cheers. Past the resident who'd quit when she couldn't take the mockery anymore. Past every person Ashford had diminished, every person he believed would disappear when he decided their value was less than his comfort. His eyes went down. His medical license was suspended before his feet touched the hospital lobby tile. The medical board moved that fast when federal charges arrived, like gravity finally remembering that falling objects need to obey physics. 2 weeks later, Nurse Rodriguez would mention it in the break room with the kind of casual cruelty that was purely factual. Ashford had found work at a strip mall off I-45, selling supplemental insurance from a folding table, unable to meet anyone's eyes when they recognized him. A man who'd held institutional power, reduced to asking if people wanted dental coverage. The arc of it was almost poetic. But right now, in this room, there was only the weight of reunion. Hannah reached for the dog tag Mitchell still held. Her fingers shook, but the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint finally giving way. It was 8 years of carrying something alone suddenly becoming shared. She pulled it over her head, and the new tag joined with the old one. David's tag. Her tag. Separate chains finally coming together against her uniform. "He'd be proud of you," Mitchell said quietly. "You stayed invisible. You stayed safe. You did exactly what they ordered you to do. And then you did it again last night." Hannah shook her head. "I broke cover. I failed." "No," Mitchell said, his voice dropping to something almost sacred. "You survived. That's never failure." The weeks that followed moved with the strange velocity of things finally being permitted to happen. The Air Force insisted on a medal ceremony despite Hannah's protests, or perhaps because of them. They held it in the Oak Creek Memorial Atrium 3 weeks after the stabbing, when her shoulder had moved from acute pain to the dull ache of healing, when her body had begun to understand that it was allowed to exist in daylight again. The atrium felt impossibly large. Every staff member not on critical duty had assembled. Residents. Nurses. Orderlies. The custodian who emptied trash in the ER. A 2-star general flew in from the Pentagon, uniform so pressed it could cut glass, bearing medals and the authority of institutions that decided what mattered. Hannah stood in her dress blues for the first time in 8 years. The fabric felt foreign and familiar simultaneously, like wearing someone else's skin and your own at exactly the same time. "Air Force Cross," the general announced. The medal went into place with ceremony and weight. For conspicuous gallantry in defense of Allied personnel under direct fire. The atrium was silent except for his voice echoing off the glass ceiling like a courtroom finally delivering verdict. Silver Star. Valor under fire and command presence in a combat environment designated impossibly hostile. The metal caught the light. Silver. Achievement. Proof that what Hannah had done was real. Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster. Combat wound sustained in the defense of others. When it finished, Mitchell approached. He moved without crutches now, had spent his recovery learning to walk again, using Hannah's field medicine as the foundation for his own salvation. He placed the dog tag around her neck, and the broken chain finally received its matching piece. 2 tags. 2 soldiers. One loss that had waited 8 years to be honored instead of erased. "Now you're complete," Mitchell said. Hannah touched both tags, feeling the weight of them against her uniform. The metal was warm from his pocket. Still holding his body heat. Still carrying what he'd preserved all these years, proof that she had mattered, that her sacrifice had meant something, that the erasure wasn't real. It was only a story someone else had written. That night, she returned to David's grave for the first time in months. Not in civilian clothes, not moving through the dark trying to be invisible. In dress blues. In uniform. In the medals that said she'd kept going when keeping going seemed impossible. She knelt and placed her hand on the headstone. "I didn't fail," she whispered. "I survived. And I'm still saving lives. Just like you taught me." Oak Creek Memorial offered her an attending physician position. The Air Force pulled strings, her combat medical experience counting for more than a normal career ladder could measure. She moved through the same hallways where she'd tried to be invisible, but now residents sought her guidance. Nurses asked her questions with deference that wasn't condescension. She was Major Hannah Clarke, and her legend walked beside her like a second shadow. In the supply closet where Ashford had cornered her, she trained a new resident on a procedure that would take most doctors years to master. Her hand steady. Her voice calm. The weight of both dog tags a constant reminder of what it cost to survive and stay human. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? We read every single comment, and your stories matter.